So tomorrow, South Africa will observe a Human Rights Day, a day to remember all those who gave their blood, sweat and tears for the rights that every South African is and should be enjoying to this day. The 21st of March is also a day of commemoration for the South African Human Rights Commission, which is mandated to protect, promote and monitor those rights that South Africans have. The theme this year is all about unity and renewal, which seems fitting following what the country went through in July last year, events of which we are still feeling the effects of. Let's catch up with my colleague Masego Rahlaga, who is at Constitution Hill this morning, where the Human Rights Day Festival is happening. A very good morning to you, Masego. A very important day in South Africa's history that we acknowledge annually. Give us a sense of what's happening there where you are.
Well, Rapia, this is our 2022 Human Rights edition of Newslink here on eNCA. And of course, I'm at the Constitution Hill with the team as well as a few guests to talk about the importance of Human Rights Day in South Africa, how far we've come. And you mentioned something very important. What happened in July last year, of course, did contravene many human rights. So let's start with our first guest here, and that is Gashwal Brooks. He's from the South African Human Rights Commission spokesperson there. Gashwal, thank you very much for your time here on Newslink. Now, my colleague Rapiwa actually, made an example of what happened in July last year. The Human Rights Commission, investigated that, spoke to a few stakeholders who could have explained how that happened, and many other atrocities you've been investigating at the South African Human Rights Commission. Tell me about the importance of today and the importance of the Commission itself.
Good morning, and thank you for that, Masego. Look, the fact of the matter is that when we look at human rights, that's exactly not even the glue, the foundation for our existence as equal, dignified, free beings in South Africa. And that applies to all people throughout the country. It's essential, it's extremely important, because if we have to go back in history, to this day in 1960, people weren't seen as free, people weren't seen as equal, people weren't treated with dignity. And that is why we had 69 people tragically being killed in Sharpeville. This Constitution and the Bill of Rights contained within it is exactly what gives right to that, or makes that a reality. But the South African Human Rights Commission has a threefold mandate when looking at those human rights that we talk about, Chapter 2 of the Constitution, and that is to protect, promote, as well as monitor the attainment of particular human rights. So ultimately, it's extremely important that we ensure that we're able to continue our lives based on the rights that we do have. And the South African Human Rights Commission is actually exactly doing that. By promoting rights, like what we're doing now, discussing human rights as we are, we're teaching people about what their rights are ultimately, number one. Number two, through protecting human rights, if you have an issue, if there is a legal issue, we are able to take the necessary action and ensure that people are protected. And monitoring is to make sure that, the circumstances that we live in, we don't assume that the Constitution itself is going to solve problems, that we're actually investigating and making sure, doing the necessary research to understand whether those human rights are being realized for ordinary people.
Tell me about the July unrest. You had people coming in to investigate about how they were affected. Some human rights were violated during that time. Business, for instance, people's livelihoods came to a standstill. And there was a report from experts who said that the entire Cabinet should take responsibility for that. We heard the President at the State of the Nation address saying they do take responsibility. But as the Human Rights Commission, don't you think it should go further than that? Rather than to just say we take responsibility and we move on. Till today, we're feeling the repercussions of what happened in July.
For sure. Look, I think there's two things at play here, and where human rights have a role to play. Yes, human rights were indeed violated during that particular period. I mean, let's start with the right to life, where more than 300 people lost their lives during that horrible period in July. But beyond that, we also need to look at how rights have been realized and what led people to leave their homes, and then go onto the streets, go into those businesses, loot, and then participate in the civil unrest. And it goes beyond unhappiness or unease over the incarceration of a former president. It goes to the fact that people are poor, people are hungry. We live in the most unequal society in the world. We see increasing rates of unemployment. We see increasing rates of poverty. And that boils back to the realization of socioeconomic rights. So we really looked at how the human rights environment, in essence, led up to that particular situation, and then how, and then looking also at how our rights in turn were protected during that particular period. Freedom and security of the person, for example, is extremely important. What happened during that particular period? Why is it that we saw failure in the necessary intelligence that was needed, policing that was needed, etc., to ensure that there is a concerted effort to make sure that we are safe. And many other rights that we can sort of rattle down, but that's the basics.
Yeah, definitely. So how do we move forward then from July? Because like I said, we're still feeling the pinch. A lot of people's businesses still have not reopened, for instance. Their livelihoods have still been ruined. And this, by the way, Gashwal, found us already suffering from the fact that our economy, economic activity was already closed and shut down because of the lockdown. Many people would say that there were human rights violations there. The lockdown also had some violations against people having to move around, So how do we go around our constitution, the government trying to choose between health and the economy?
So I think, excuse me, in fairness, we need to understand the rights can be limited under severe circumstances. And I think rights like freedom of movement, as you had pointed out, needed to be limited because we were in a global pandemic. We haven't seen this in more than a century. And the fact of the matter is ultimately that you needed to then ensure that you try to keep the entire society safe while simultaneously looking at, for example, the social network, the social safety nets that were then implemented during that particular period. I'm not saying it's necessarily sufficient, but those are some of the measures that were taken. We're at this particular stage now, and yes, it's very true that we took a major knock because of the pandemic, and then in turn because of the actions that we saw during July. And the only way that we can fix this is for people to, number one, understand what their rights actually are and how they then can assert those rights through non-violent means that do not put not only the security of the nation at risk, but also ultimately the economy at risk, and worsen the situation ultimately. Because let's be honest, what happened in July yesterday may have, during that particular period of looting and people taking things, may have solved their problems temporarily, inverted commas. But it left us with long-lasting consequences as a result. So it's ultimately for us to empower people, for them to understand what their rights are, how they can exercise those rights, and in turn what mechanisms they should use, because the mechanisms exist for people to be able to assert their rights, for them to be able to make sure that their rights are adhered to.
Now, this week, the Human Rights Commission had, you started investigations into the advertising industry. There was a lot that was said, particularly, a lot of people would never forget that Tresemme ad, where, we had black people's hair basically being shown as unprofessional in 2020, I think it was, or 2020, or 2019. I mean, in this day and age, we're finding the South African Human Rights Commission sitting down and investigating things like that. There's a lot of people who would say, why do we still have to be justifying our hair? I have natural hair all the time. You have natural hair all the time. Why do I need to still be explaining to people that my hair is professional? I am beautiful in my hair, and I'm beautiful the way that I look.
Well, and that's exactly why we are investigating it and looking at how, people are being portrayed through the media and through advertising in particular, and what messages are being sent. And I think what I found also very enlightening was that beyond sort of those particular immediate examples that we can use, like the Tresemme /Click/ Unilever ad, like the H&M ad prior to that, there were other concerns raised as well in terms of food, for example, and how food is being marketed to children, and then break it down further to particular race groups. And you find that, unfortunately, it's unhealthy stuff that gets the lion's share of promotion and marketing into particular children within particular race groups. And that's very concerning. So we need to look at that holistically, and that is why ultimately I think that we need to understand that human rights is not the purview of the South African Human Rights Commission alone. It is the state, it is business, it is civil society, faith-based communities, and ordinary citizens. Everyone has a role to play in upholding and protecting human rights and making sure that they're realized. It's not just the purview of a few. All of us have a role to play. All of us have to protect. All of us have to promote. All of us have to make sure that human rights are being realized in South Africa.
And, you know, the regulatory body that is supposed to be looking after or making sure that adverts or the advertising world does not advertise, for instance, like you said, unhealthy food, the adverts go to a certain group, you know, adverts, even there was a detergent advert, I believe, a few years even before H&M, where a black woman in a brown t-shirt was considered dirty, and as she took off that shirt, it turned into a white woman in a white shirt. It's an advert that was out there, and that was considered clean. So, you know, when it comes to things like that, this regulatory body is saying that it doesn't have the authority to actually impose any, I know they didn't want to use the word punishment, but to impose sanctions because they need to.
Well, there are two things at stake here. It's freedom of expression, and I think that we need to uphold, you know, the right to freedom of expression. And you know, someone once, I can't remember who specifically, but someone famously said that the only reason why we need to protect the right to freedom of expression is because someone might say something you don't like, and we need to protect that person's right to say something that we don't like. But coupled with that, we need a sense of responsibility when it comes to freedom of expression, right? And I think that the regulatory bodies, as well as the South African Human Rights Commission, have a role to play together in educating people and making them understand what their blind spots are. Because I do think that in all of these particular instances, it wasn't overtly aimed at being racist or being unfairly discriminatory, you know, based on race. It was based on ignorance, where someone looked at something and couldn't understand or see the innate discrimination within the product that they're putting out there.
Oblivious.
They're oblivious to it. And this is an opportunity to say, but hang on a second, who is, for example, sitting within that creative room? Who is in your boardroom that finally approves this product? And does this person have sufficient knowledge and understanding that this is in fact racist, or that this is in fact discriminatory, or that it places people in a, because sometimes it's not outright racist, but it definitely casts a particular group of people in a very negative light. And do we want to continue on that basis?
It's very interesting that you mentioned, for instance, that, you know, everybody has rights, and sometimes one right will trump the other. For instance, COVID-19 and the regulations that had to be imposed on South Africans meant that we don't have freedom to move around, etc. But there was also this huge pandemic that we had to deal with, etc. And some people would say government was well within their rights, you know. So it's always quite interesting to discuss, you know, how one right trumps the other, and how important is it for South Africans to actually read the Constitution, know their rights, and know how to interpret that at this moment now, my right is this, you have violated this right.
Two things, again, I never like using the term trumping rights. I think that all rights are, in essence, obviously we have non-derogable rights, which means that your right to dignity, for example, is something that will always exist. You can't limit someone's right to dignity, as an example.
Yes.
But the point that I'm making is all rights, to some extent, except for your non-derogable rights, can be limited. And at times there is a need for those particular rights to be limited. Your right to freedom of expression, going back to, you know, the example that we used with the advertising hearings that we held. Well, you have the right to freedom of expression, but you need to do so responsibly. But beyond exercising your right responsibly, you know, there's also certain limitations on it. So hate speech in that, you know, it's sort of free for all when it comes to freedom of expression in South Africa. So that's but one example. Some of the other, going back to looking at rights and, you know, the balancing of rights and people understanding what their rights are. I always say to people that the simplest bit of law that you can ever read and comprehend for yourself is Chapter 2 of the Constitution. The Constitution is it's a small, dense document. But, the most important part is Chapter 2, which contains all of your rights. It's easily written, easily understood. And constitutions can be freely downloaded from the internet. You can freely access them in libraries and public spaces. If people read that portion and understand that portion of the Constitution, it solves most of your problems, because you understand what your rights are, what the limitations on those particular rights are, and what your actual rights are, what they actually are. And I think that is probably the most important thing that anyone can do. The Commission obviously has a duty and a responsibility, going back to our mandate, to promote, and through providing education, whether it be through advocacy or a program like this where we're discussing these issues. But simultaneously, it's incumbent on all of us to take that responsibility to say, hang on, I need to learn about my rights.
All right, Gashwal Brooks, thank you very much, the spokesperson of the South African Human Rights Commission. Rapua, I believe you have a guest with you back in the Johannesburg studios to discuss further human rights and basically all our rights here in South Africa. Back to you in studio.
Thank you very much, Masego. Very interesting conversation, and I actually just wanted to engage you a little bit further about this notion of a natural hair and the fact that we always have to explain ourselves for choosing to wear our natural hair. It's very problematic, and it's just one of many, many things that I find we struggle with even in a democracy, Masego. And then another issue, which I actually want to get your opinion on here, is the issue of the xenophobia, the operations Dudula and things like that. Are those not issues of human rights as well?
They definitely are, Rapua, and we're going to keep Gashwal here while we throw back to you in studio, because we are expecting a guest who actually represents foreign nationals living in South Africa, so that we can discuss that further and get her thoughts on what's been happening with your Operation Dudula, for instance. She is here, so as soon as you throw back to us, I'll definitely have more discussion along with Gashwal and Sharon in terms of the human rights of everybody living in South Africa.
No, absolutely. We've got Masego going to give us more engagement around human rights issues and issues around maintaining our democracy as we have attained it.